And so Oglethorpe committed himself at that time to become a prison reformer, and was trying to led an effort at the age of 26 to empty the prisons across England of debtors, and was actually successful. So tens and tens of thousands of people were released. They ended up back on the street, sort of homeless and beggars, many of them at that time. And then so he began to think, so that's not right either. And so is there the possibility of creating in his mind, a utopian community in the New World where these less fortunate people could come, could work, and could prosper. And that's what started the genesis of the idea of founding the colony of Georgia. Things don't always turn out the way one imagines, but what's so interesting about the first 10 years of the colony of Georgia, and he was only here 10 years before they threw him out. He believed it should be unlike every other British colony. There should be freedom to practice whatever religion you wanted. He believed in respecting the rights of the Native Americans, the people that whose land it was that we took. And he also believed that the colony had to be slave-free. And at that point, for those first 10 years, the colony of Georgia was slave-free, the only British colony in the world that was slave-free. And that's, in fact, what cost him his job. The Spanish were above us, the Spanish were below us, both very heavily invested in slavery. And Georgia eventually followed quite quickly. And Oglethorpe was sort of exiled back to Great Britain, where he and his wife ended up living a fairly long life. So I think it's appropriate for a university to carry his name. Again, not much older than most of you, who not only was a sort of rebel and a free thinker and a visionary, but he went beyond writing term papers about such things, and he was an activist and changed the life of thousands of people around. So that's what we celebrate today. And we're fortunate to have Tina Fernandez with us. Tina, why don't you come out for a round of applause. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, President Schall. Thank you guys so much for being here. I am really, that was quite a show out there. Congrats to everybody who ran around that track. And I'm really excited to be here with you all to spend a few minutes talking about some of my work and engaging with you on this very special day.
Let's talk about running, because you got runners in your family. Did you run the marathon, or did you just run Peachtree?
Yeah, so I started running when I was 15 years old, and have been running ever since, sometimes away from people, but mostly just for my own mental health. And I ran my first marathon 2 years ago. I ran the Houston Marathon with my brother, who's 11 years younger than I am, and never in a million years that I would run a marathon. Ran it at the age of 44, so it's never too late. There are things that you can accomplish way past your 20s.
And did you finish in less than 44 minutes? You would not see hours?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. That's yeah. I've always wanted to run a marathon, and then I wake up from the dream and go again. So I remember when we interviewed you 6 years ago, and you sort of shared your story, and your family story, which is just a really compelling story. So why don't we start there? Yeah.
Okay, so before this session, I had the great honor of having lunch with our Achieve Atlanta scholars who are here at Oglethorpe. So shout out to all the Achieve Atlanta scholars, all the students. And one of the young women at the lunch asked me, did you always think you wanted to go into education? And that is a good question for talking about where my passion for education comes from. So I grew up in South Texas. I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, right on the Mexican-Texas border. I was born on the Texas side, and I was 20 minutes from Mexico, and at that time, it was a very fluid community. People went back and forth. We had family on both sides, and the area that I lived in was almost, I would say 90% Mexican-American. My mother was born in the mountains of Mexico in the state of Hidalgo, and immigrated to the United States when she was 19 years old, looking for work. Did not get to finish high school, and came to the U.S. and started working. My dad was born in the United States. He is what we call, I would say, a fourth generation Chicano, meaning Mexican-American ancestry, always from the same part of Texas, but the borders moved. And so at some point it was Mexico, and then it became Texas, and so his family had always been in South Texas. And he was a school teacher. So he and my mother met when they were very young, decided to get married, and had a family. And my dad was the first in his family to go to college, and he was a school teacher. And my mother was an immigrant without a college education, without a high school education. And so it was a really interesting experience in my household because, we had my dad who was a teacher and who really endorsed education, and then my mother who worked in a factory with all of the other women in our town, 10 hours a day sewing pants. And so we had a really interesting experience growing up. I had a really wonderful childhood, loving home, loving community, low-income community. And so the county that I'm from has been deemed the poorest congressional district many times over the last 40 years in the country. And so very low-income community. We had one public high school, went to public school, and I was good at school. So like many of you probably here in this room, I liked school. School came easy to me. I got good grades. And my family, my dad especially, was always said to us, you guys are going to go do something great. And as a side story, my dad had actually wanted to be a lawyer. And he had managed to graduate college and then enrolled in law school, and because of family circumstances and financial circumstances, had to drop out. So from the moment that I can remember, my father said, you're going to Harvard, and you're going to be a lawyer. So that's what I was going to do. And you don't question, what dad says, and that's your goal in life. When I got to
hear all that, you don't question what.
Yeah. When I got to high school, I realized that wasn't that easy to do. But I did get lucky enough, and I was accepted to Harvard undergrad, and so I traveled from my little community in South Texas up to Boston to do my undergraduate degree. And when I got there, what I realized was I had heard the term educational inequity, and I had, I knew that there were rich people in the world, but I didn't really know what wealth looked like until I got to sort of the most hollowed halls of, academia and a very elite institution with families who had, founded our country, and realized that we had not had the same education. So I came from a school where you could not walk down the halls because of the crowded hallways. We didn't have any AP classes. And I was going to school with people who had studied abroad and taken every AP class available, and I was saying had Olympic-sized pools in their schools, and all of that is great, and every child should have an opportunity for that, but we didn't have that. And so that's where the fire really started. The other thing was that at that time, less than 5% of the students at Harvard were Latino. So there are very few students who look like me. And I felt a little bit of the guilt that comes with sort of leaving your community, having an opportunity, and thinking about your friends back home, and how so many of them should have that same opportunity. So I started getting involved in lots of youth activities, youth development, and from there my career has always been focused on ensuring that every kid in our country has access to an equal and excellent education.
Had you ever left the state of Texas?
I had left the state of Texas to go to, I had gone to Mexico my whole life. So I had lots of experience in Mexico, and my mom's whole family lived there. And there was one very formative trip. And again, this is where exposure comes into play. My cousin, who was about 15 years older than I was, went on a cruise with her friends and met this guy who she ended up marrying, and he was from Massachusetts. So when I was 11 years old, they drove from Texas to Massachusetts to visit his family, and they asked my parents if they could take me with them. And so they did, and that was my out-of-state trip, and in fact, they took me to the campus and walked me around as a kid, and so that sort of imprinted in my brain about, there are other places that you can go.
Let's talk about the border for a second. I was in El Paso last fall, and I had spent very little time on the border. And what struck me, and I was only there a couple days, but what struck me is how fluid that the border is in a way that people who don't live there get. And it's not as fluid as it was when you grew up, but it is, the people who were shopping at that Walmart, there are a lot of people from Mexico come across the border with not with a passport, but with a card and shop at Walmart every day. So what, talk about the border.
Yeah, growing up on the border is a very interesting experience, and one of my favorite Chicana authors, Gloria Anzaldúa, wrote a book called Borderlands, and it's all about what it means to grow up on the border. And whether it's the border from the US and Mexico or in the Middle East, if you grow up in these border towns, you understand that there is this sort of, the phenomenon of a border is it's an artificial line that separates people, separates countries. But the people who are from there have lived there for centuries. Their families have gone back and forth. And what it meant was that we were bilingual, we were bicultural, we had experiences on both sides of the border, but there was also a very strange thing, because when you drove the 5 minutes from the US across the bridge to Mexico, you definitely felt that you were somewhere else. So there was a lot of the part of our identity is being of two places, of speaking two languages, of being able to bridge two cultures. And I always sort of took that for granted. But recently I was in a meeting where somebody said, well, what's your superpower? Right? So if you've never been asked that, you should think about that. What's your superpower?
It's going to be like an interview question?
Yeah. Okay, so what's your superpower? And I have decided that my superpower is that I'm a border crosser. Because I grew up having to navigate different worlds and adapt quickly and figure out how to operate in different scenarios.
There's one interesting thing. So I was doing some research in El Paso. So El Paso used to be in Mexico. It's like El Paso's never moved, but the border just keeps moving around it. So fascinating. So, so when you interviewed 6 years ago, I think your husband works in Atlanta. Had you already moved?
We had already moved. So I grew up in Texas, was teaching at the University of Texas School of Law, and thought I had the job that I was going to have for the rest of my life. And another topic of conversation today at lunch was, how did you get from where you wanted, from where you started to where you were going to be, and did you have a plan? In a million years, I could have never planned where I ended up, right? And so like this idea that right now, where you're sitting, you may have a goal and you have a vision, and that's great. And there are so many things that are going to happen in your life that you can't even imagine at this point that are going to impact what you eventually become. So I was happily teaching, and then my husband got recruited for a job here in Atlanta, and it made sense for our family, and so we decided to move. So I moved without knowing what I was going to do here. And in academia, there's a term that I love to share with people. When somebody moves for a job and the spouse comes along, they call them the trailing spouse. And I just think that's such an interesting term, right? It's almost like you have a tail or something, right? Like, so this is the trailing spouse, and then you have to figure out like what that person's going to do.
Well, there is a new name for trailing spouse.
Oh, is there? Yes.
Because we've interviewed some faculty candidates. They've used the phrase, which I had never heard until this year, which is, it's a two-body two-body family. I'm part of a two-body, yeah, so it's a better, I don't know if it's better than trailing spouse, but.
Right. But the fact is that you have other people in your life that you have to consider when you make these decisions. So I got to Atlanta, and the most obvious choice was to go back to a university, and I started looking at the universities here and thinking about where I wanted to go. But I had a nagging feeling for the last several years that I was supposed to get back to working directly on educational issues and helping more young people get their degree. And so I spent a year consulting and doing some projects for different educational organizations in Atlanta and getting to know the community here. And then, you know, all the stars aligned, and this is where they say luck is preparation and opportunity, something like that. And Achieve Atlanta was looking for its first executive director. And I had a background in higher ed. I actually started my career as a teacher. I was a Teach for America Corps member and taught in New York City. And then, you know, had the law degree, and so it all worked out, and I was able to come on as the founding executive director.
So, what were your first impressions of the Atlanta Public Schools?
So when I was applying for the job, I did a lot of research to find out about Atlanta Public Schools, and here's a couple of things that at that time were true. The first was that the district had only about a 51% high school graduation rate, which is abysmal and tragic in and of itself. The second thing that I learned was that of students who graduated, only, of all APS students, only 50% graduated from college, and from high school, and only 14% went on to get a post-secondary degree of any kind within 6 years of their high school graduation. So just based on those metrics, it was not a successful district. Now, the other thing that I found out about Atlanta was that, you know, we're going through this amazing economic boom. We have one of the highest concentration of Fortune 500 companies in the entire country. But we have been named by the Brookings Institute the capital of inequality for the last 3 out of 5 years. We have the highest income inequality of any major city in the United States. We also have the lowest rate of social mobility, which means that a child who's born in poverty in Atlanta has almost no chance of getting out of poverty in his or her lifetime. So those are pretty stark statistics. The assets, though, are also pretty amazing. We have a thriving philanthropic community. The students at Atlanta Public Schools are smart and motivated, and they have dreams for their lives. We have people at the district and at nonprofits who are really trying to make things better for them. And so I felt like this was an opportunity to be able to work on an issue that I really cared about. And not only is it imperative for the families and students that we serve, but also for our city. There's no way that we can have a thriving economy, a thriving city, if we're not preparing our students to be able to fill the jobs and to be engaged citizens in the city of Atlanta. So I'm happy to say that because of the work of the current superintendent and her administration, because of the work of several nonprofits, things look very different now. So the high school graduation rate has gone up to almost 80% in Atlanta Public Schools since 2014. So let's just... And now 62% of seniors are seamlessly enrolling in college, which means that they're graduating from high school and going straight to college in the fall after their graduation. So let's give a... And our students are persisting at higher rates than most of our students are low income, so similarly situated students are not doing as well. Our students are persisting. And this year in 2016, we'll have our first graduating class of Achieve Atlanta Scholars, including our first Achieve Atlanta Scholars at Oglethorpe, Dayla Jackson, who is here somewhere. So we're going to be here for her graduation.
Back in the 60s, when the federal mandate to desegregate public schools happened, at white flight, most of the whites left Atlanta Public Schools, went to private schools, went out to the suburbs. So you end up with a district that's overwhelmingly African American, poor, more now probably Latina. And I think there was in this 50% grad rate, it's not like that just happened in 1 year. It was just traditionally, year after year after year, decade after decade, Atlanta public schools were failing to graduate their students, let alone have them think about going to college. So how does a system that's been, so corrupt for 50, 60 years be transformed in 6 years? I mean, how's that happen?
Yeah, what changed? So I think it's really important to understand that there are many reasons, systemic reasons, for why we have the situation that we had back in 2014 with the low graduation rate. And by the way, this is the case for most urban school districts across the country. So there's sort of a series of issues that happen. One is you've got state budgets that are being cut, and after the recession, the investment in public education has continued to decline. It hasn't gone back to sort of original levels. Money is not everything, but money sure helps. You've also got increasing bureaucracy that is placing on our teachers administrative demands that really take their time away from teaching students and from really engaging students. And you've got the problems of poverty, and those are very real. So what I'll say is when I was in my 20s, I used to think, and I was part of sort of the emerging education reform movement, which I think at this point, people don't even say those words anymore. But at that point, it was a bunch of 20-year-olds, and we're like, you know what? We're not going to blame poverty. We're gonna go into schools. We're going to get great teachers, and great teaching is going to solve all the problems. Well, we were very naive, because if you grow up poor, you know that the problems of poverty are real. If you don't have a stable place to sleep at night, if you don't have sufficient food, if you don't have health care, if any of you have pulled an all-nighter, and I know many of you have, you know that the next day, you're not really good for learning. And if that's your reality every day, the conditions that these kids are coming to school in, and the fact that we're not doing anything as a society to solve those conditions make it very difficult for students to thrive. So we have all of those situations. And we also, a school is like a business or like a university. You need to have really talented people who know how to drive efficient systems, efficient processes, to manage other people, to coach people, to motivate people, etc. So my theory is that the new, the superintendent who will be finishing her term this year came in and really set up some great structures. She set up culture that said students first. And this is not about compliance, this is about excellence, and we're going to do everything that we can to serve these students. She got the community to reinvest in out-of-school efforts and wraparound services and things to help the students. So it was really a massive effort, but you have to have vision, and then you have to hold people accountable to that vision to make this kind of change.
And to share a little bit about what Achieve does.
Yeah. So Achieve Atlanta, our vision is that Atlanta no longer be a city where race and income predict post-secondary attainment or upward mobility. So right now, think to yourself, what do you think is the highest predictor of whether a student will go to college? I heard money over here. So the number one predictor of whether or not a child will go to college is how much money your parents make. That's it. So it's not what school you went to, it's not what your GPA was in high school, it's not those factors. Number one predictor is the amount of money your parents have. We need that not to be the case in this country. With rising inequality comes rising unrest, and I think regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, we all are feeling that we're in a very precarious state in our democracy. And so education is one of the things that can solve for this. So I think I lost my train.
So Achieve, what is
Achieve. So what does Achieve do? So we do three things. We help students get to college, we help students pay for college, and then we help them succeed in college so that they can get their degree. So on the Getting to College, we work with Atlanta Public Schools. We've hired a team of college advisors, placed them in all of the public schools so that they can help students with their college application process. You guys know how difficult that was when you were seniors. and have done lots of things like implement the SAT in the school day so that every junior is taking the SAT their junior year, and really working with the district on creating a college-going culture. The second thing we do is that we provide a need-based scholarship. So you may or may not know this. You probably know this because you go to school in Georgia. Georgia is one of 2 states in the entire country that does not offer need-based financial aid. And so if you come from a family that makes $15,000 a year, you're not going to be able to afford to go to school that costs $20,000 a year. And so a lot of our families weren't even thinking about college because they didn't have the funds to pay. So Achieve Atlanta has a need-based scholarship, and to date, we're funding nearly 3,000 scholars across 200 colleges and universities. And the only requirement is that you fill out your FAFSA, and if you meet the income requirement, you get the Achieve Atlanta scholarship. And so then after that, once students are in college, we partner with colleges and universities, and Oglethorpe was one of our very first partners. So big round for Oglethorpe. One of the OGs, and we partner with schools to make sure that when the scholars are on the campus, they're getting the supports that they need, both on the academic side and on the social emotional side. So college is hard for everybody. The transition is difficult for everybody. It can be especially difficult if you come from a community like mine, where everybody looks like you do, and you go on a campus and there's a different culture, different norms, different expectations. And so we provide those supports to students.